Welcome to the beginning of the Wednesday, the last day, and our session is on metaphysics. And let's see, I think we're going to begin with Gloria, since the slides are up. So Gloria Frost is our first presenter. She's from the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Her recent and amazing book in 2022 was Aquinas on Efficient Causation and Causal Powers with Cambridge University Press. And she's working on a second book called Divine and Created Causality in Medieval Philosophy. So I keep the introductions short because we're all philosophers and we just want to start pummeling each other. So without further ado, let's get to Gloria.
Thank you, David. And thank you for your work to organize such a great conference. So my topic today is Aquinas on dispositional modality and failures of natural causes due to weakness. So the main question I'm going to be looking at in this presentation is, can a natural cause fail to produce its effect, even given that there are no impediments to its exercise of causality? So I think it's obvious, just from our experience, that natural causes can be impeded in producing their effects. So if a fire is about to burn a Summa of Aquinas, someone could throw water on it to impede the fire from burning. So the question I'm asking is, assuming that there are no impediments, does Aquinas think that a natural cause can fail to produce its effect? So there are two different competing ways of thinking about the modal relationship between a cause and its effect that I want to explore in this presentation. So the first is known as conditional necessity. So on the view that natural causes relate to their effects by conditional necessity, it's the case that assuming no impediments, the cause necessarily produces its effect. The other view that I want to look at is one that comes from contemporary philosophy called dispositional modality. So dispositional modality is the view that natural causes have a tendency towards production of their effects, but they don't do so necessarily, even given no impediments. So even without an impediment, a natural cause can just randomly, by chance, fail to produce its effect. And this type of modality is conceived as standing partway between necessity and contingency. So necessary causes, they can't fail to produce their effects. Contingent causes have an indeterminate relationship between production and non-production of their effect. So dispositional modality is kind of between those two. So in this view, the natural cause doesn't necessarily produce its effect, even given no impediments, but it's not indeterminate between production and non-production. It's got a tendency towards producing its effects. So the random failures are going to be rare. So you might be wondering, why in a presentation on Aquinas am I looking at this contemporary idea of modality and whether Aquinas held to it? So the reason is, in contemporary philosophy today, there's a resurgence of neo-Aristotelian views of causal powers, and a particular contemporary philosopher, Stephen Mumford, has claimed that it's perhaps Aquinas who is the greatest advocate of dispositional modality. And as you'll see later in the presentation, some historical interpreters of Aquinas have interpreted his views in such a way that it would align with this contemporary idea of dispositional modality. And there is some textual evidence to support this. So in the text on the slide from the commentary in the sentences, Aquinas writes, "The effects of natural causes follow from them for the most part, and they fail in a minority of cases." So it seems like he's saying that natural causes tend to produce their effects for the most part, but that they can just fail by chance in a minority of cases. So the central interpretive issue in Aquinas is, what is the nature of causal failures due to weakness? So how should we understand these cases where natural causes fail, even when it seems that there's no external impediment? So in texts like Book 3 of the Summa Contra Gentiles, chapter 73, Aquinas claims that there's three factors that can prevent a natural cause from producing its effect. The first two are extrinsic to the agent, so an interference of an external agent, so like throwing the water on the fire before it burns the Summa. The second is indisposition of the matter that the agent acts on. So like you've got a wet log, fire can't burn it because the log's not properly disposed to be burned. Now the third, for my purposes, is the most interesting. Aquinas talks about a type of impediment that's not outside of the agent, but rather something within the agent that's weakness of its power. So the central thing I want to look at is how do we make sense of Aquinas' views on weakness of power, because he doesn't really elaborate on them when he talks about weakness of power. He just kind of moves on after stating that this is something that can lead to a failure. So there's two competing ways that we can understand a material agent's weakness. So the first way to understand it would be as a perpetual state that arises from the very nature of a terrestrial material being. And on this view, material beings are just perpetually in this state of being liable to random failures without warning or prediction. And this interpretation would align with dispositional modality because there's no determining factor that explains the causal failure. It just happens sometimes. It's just part of the nature of material things that their powers just randomly fail. Now, the historical interpreter, one of the historical interpreters who thinks of Aquinas' views in this way is Charles de Koninck. And so those of you who are familiar with Aquinas' views on celestial beings, you know that he has like this way of understanding the forms of terrestrial and celestial beings that's somewhat different. So he thinks that the substantial forms of celestial beings perfectly actualize their matter. So celestial beings, while their matter is under one substantial form, there's no potential for taking on another form. So they're immutable. But terrestrial beings, even while their matter is under a substantial form, they retain this potentiality for substantial change, for taking on a different substantial form. So our log, even while it's actualized by the form of wood, it's got this potential to turn to ash. It's got this potential for another substantial form. So there's this respect in which there's an indeterminacy in the matter of terrestrial beings that leaves them open to substantial change. And de Koninck claims in this paper, Reflections on the Problem of Indetermination, that that same sort of indeterminacy of matter just makes terrestrial beings perpetually liable to random causal failures. So he writes, whatever the perfection of the form, there always remains a margin of indetermination in the composite which exceeds it and can cause it to lack or achieve an effect in no way predetermined in the nature, neither particular nor universal, since this margin exists in the entire universe. So in his view, just the way material beings are, in the terrestrial realm at least, that they've got this kind of like weakness or indeterminacy that they can randomly fail. So here's a second way that we can understand a material agent's weakness of power. So another way to understand weakness is that it's a transitory state. So not something that just arises from the very nature of material beings, but something that arises from time to time due to a contingent defect in the agent. And so whenever the agent has this defect, it's going to be weak and it'll consistently fail. And this understanding of weakness of power aligns with the conditional necessity interpretation such that natural causes will produce their effect, assuming no impediment. So weakness is just a type of impediment that arises internally that can cause a causal failure from natural causes. So it would explain the causal failure, so it's not random or by chance. So how do we know which of these interpretations is right for Aquinas? So I propose that we have to look at his views on what determines the strength or weakness of material agents' causal powers. So Aquinas thinks that the active causal powers of material substances are just accidental forms in them. So a fire, for example, heats through its accidental form of heat. And if we look to Aquinas' views on the intention and remission of accidental forms, so those changes where powers get weaker or stronger, he talks about how certain accidental forms can vary in the degree to which they actualize material substances or sometimes uses Neoplatonic language of participation. So I think he means the same thing, but sometimes he prefers the Aristotelian claim that forms like heat can actualize a substance more or less perfectly, but sometimes he prefers that Neoplatonic expression of that the substance is participating more or less perfectly in the accidental form. So a hotter fire, for example, participates more perfectly in the form of heat or is actualized more perfectly by it, and a less hot fire is less perfectly participating or less perfectly actualized. And so the degree of a causal power is going to correspond to the degree of participation or actualization by a form. So there's a nice text where he says as much on the slide. He says, due to the fact that a subject participates more in a quality, it acts more vehemently because each one acts insofar as it is in act. Therefore, that which is more perfectly reduced to act acts more perfectly. And I think we can infer the converse from this text, that weaker natural causes, they're participating less perfectly or actualized less perfectly by the accidental form, so they act less perfectly. So I think there's a further question we need to ask, though. What causes a substance to vary in its degree of actualization or participation in an accidental form? Is it something that just randomly happens, or is there some determining factor that explains the degree of participation? So DeConnick, in another one of his papers, he talks about terrestrial agents' forms as being vulnerable to be unexpectedly swallowed up by the matter. So I have a picture of an actual sinkhole in a soccer field in Illinois. This is a real thing that happened, and it's kind of like how I think of it, that the fire is just burning and the matter like sucks up the form and it suddenly gets weaker. And so on his view, it seems that it's just kind of like in that indetermination of matter that it can just randomly like suck some of the actuality out of the form. I don't think this is Aquinas' view, though. I think that in Aquinas' view, the changes of degree of actualization by a form, they happen in virtue of exercises of efficient causality. So Aquinas, when writing about changes of intention and remission, he writes, but that which is less hot or less white is not in potency to a form, since it already has a form in act, but it's in potency to a more perfect mode of participation. In this it receives through the agent's action. So we got our pot of water on the stove and it suddenly gets less hot. I don't think Aquinas thinks like just randomly the matter like sucks some of the life out of the form. Something like throwing ice is what's going to cause that water to participate less perfectly or get less hot. You need some agent that's acting on a substance to change its degree of participation or actualization by a form. So there's another text, it was a little bit too long to reproduce, in Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 48, article 4, Aquinas talks a little more specifically about how changes that are the weakening of a actualization by a form happen. And he talks about agents causing these changes by introducing contrary dispositions into the patient that it's acting on. So those of you who are familiar with the Aristotelian physical system, which Aquinas adopts, there's 4 fundamental qualities, hot, cold, wet, and dry, and they have a contrary relation to each other. And it's by introducing a contrary quality in a substance that it comes to participate less perfectly in the contrary form. So I think we can infer from this that the degree of weakness of an agent's power corresponds to the degree of intensity of contrary forms in the agent. So we could, if we could look at under a metaphysical microscope, like a fire that was like, getting less hot, we're also going to be able to see in it an increase of any forms that are contrary to heat, that there's going to be this inverse relationship. And so I think we can think of contrary forms, and especially a particular degree of a contrary form, as an impediment to the exercise of a power. And so failures due to weakness on this model are going to be uniform and predictable, and they're going to have a determining factor. we're going to be able to, if we know that a certain agent has forms that are contrary to its power inhering in it to a certain degree, we're going to know, oh, it's not going to succeed in causing its effect. And in the absence of these internal impediments, that is the contrary forms, there aren't going to be failures due to weakness. And this model aligns with conditional necessity. So failures due to weakness are just failures due to an intrinsic rather than an extrinsic impediment. So what do we do with the conflicting texts? So Aquinas says natural causes produce their effects for the most part and fail in the minority of cases. I think there's a pretty simple reading of these texts, that they're not claims about how a natural cause behaves in the same exact situation. It's not like if you put fire in certain circumstances 50 times, it's going to succeed in 45 times and fail in 5. It's a claim about that natural cause across varying circumstances, some of which include impediments, the majority of which don't. So Aquinas, when he writes about divine providence, he talks about God through his goodness ensuring that in the majority of cases, natural causes aren't impeded. So God sets up the providential ordering of the world so that impediments are rare, because God, as a provident creator, wants to see things flourish, and one of the ways that a natural cause flourishes is by reaching its characteristic effect. So I think you can read the texts that support the dispositional modality reading as consistent with conditional necessity. So even though I've tried to argue that Aquinas did not hold that natural causes operate by dispositional modality, I still think he's an important part of the story of this history, if we want to dig it up, of this contemporary idea of dispositional modality. But we have to look more to the moral realm and away from the realm of natural causes. So Bonnie Kent has some very great papers where she talks about some important differences between Aquinas' views on the moral virtues and the standard way of reading Aristotle's view on the moral virtues. So according to the standard reading, Aristotle thinks that virtuous agents can't fail to behave virtuously. So a person who has the virtue of generosity can't fail to behave generously in a circumstance that warrants it, or else Aristotle would claim they actually don't really have that virtue if they fail. They have one of those maybe intermediate character states of moral weakness or moral strength. Aquinas, by contrast, as Bonnie Kent argues, believes that the moral virtues incline agents towards virtuous actions, but they don't determine the agent to do them. That on Aquinas' view, morally virtuous agents can mess up every now and then. So Aquinas says in the Summa, someone possessing a habit might not use it or even perform a contrary action. So in Aquinas' view, if you look at text 8, the use of the habit lies in the will of man. So someone can have the moral virtues, yet by a choice of will, decide not to use them or to act against them. So I think it's fair to say that on Aquinas' view, morally virtuous agents are examples of causes that relate to their effects by dispositional modality. So the relationship between moral virtues and virtuous action, or the morally virtuous agent and virtuous action, it's not one of necessity. It's not necessarily the case that a morally virtuous agent will automatically act virtuously by necessity in every circumstance where virtue is appropriate. But it's also not one of pure contingency either. It's not a toss-up that a morally virtuous agent will behave virtuously when virtue is warranted. The moral virtue gives that agent a tendency toward morally virtuous actions. So failures are going to be possible, but they're going to be rare and unprobable. So I think this is significant in the sense that this shows that Aquinas had a third sort of way of conceiving of the modal relationship between a cause and its effect that stands partway between necessity and contingency. So if contemporary philosophers like Mumford are interested in looking at historical advocates of dispositional modality, Aquinas is an interesting example from the history of philosophy of a thinker who thought that there were causes in the world that related to their effects, not merely by contingency, but also in a less strong way than necessity. But unlike Mumford's dispositional natural causes, the failures of the virtuous agent, they aren't going to be rare or by chance. There's a factor that explains them, which is an exercise of will, a decision of will. So I think Aquinas is a little bit different, that he doesn't have things just happening in these random, inexplicable ways. There is in his thought, I think, a sense that there are determining factors or explanations for outcomes or things that happen. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gloria. And because these are being streamed, I'm going to come around with the mic. I'll start with Bob.
Thank you very much. The layout you have for the difference between external and internal causes for failure, it seems like the extrinsic are all after the agent already has produced a perfect act in itself and there's something external that gets in the way of it. What about when there's a failure or limit or indisposition of some prior external cause the agent requires in order to work properly, like dogs giving birth at the right time when the heavens are out of alignment, because that depends on that as well. In the case of the will, the intellect or the cogitative powers or the passions can be out of alignment as well, and that's not a culpable failure, but it would still be contingent if you're not looking in the right direction when you need to act regarding something, or you misunderstanding. Would that be a different kind of cause than the kind of cause you're attributing to the will?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I think there's a difference between I think the lack of a presence of a condition that's necessary versus an impediment. Aquinas talks about like preparatory cause as a type of cause, is to kind of do all these things to get that agent kind of in the right state such that it can exercise its power. And a lack of one of those causes, I think, should be thought of differently than a case where you have the agent in the right state where it can exercise its power and something else impedes it from exercising its power.
I'm just going to go right down the line to Daniel here.
Great, thanks. So I was wondering about cases where various things might follow from an act, but it doesn't, the language of impediment and stuff like that doesn't seem entirely appropriate. So one particular case I was thinking of is, I flip a coin, it comes up heads. Looked like I had the power to get it to come up to heads. I had some kind of power to get it to come up to tails. But it doesn't feel like either of those powers was impeded. No, like my power to flip and come up tails, it doesn't feel like something got in the way of that. It's just, you flip a coin and there are various things that might happen. Can you help me put that in the context? Because I was thinking even if there is a sufficient efficient cause for it coming up heads to do with the heavens or the coin or something, it looks like all I did put me in a position for it to come up heads, but it didn't feel like tails was impeded, and if it come up tails, it wasn't that heads was impeded. But yeah, I was interested in how you're thinking about that case.
Yeah, good. So I think the way Aquinas would think of a case like that is that what you have is a power to flip a coin. You have a power to flip a coin, and from your flipping of after you flip the coin, there are different causes. You're always a cause within a network of causes, and the way that those causes are acting, or the way they're positioned even, is going to impact whether it comes out heads or tails. So Aquinas also thinks that, so in addition to causes always operating in a network where other things are influencing how their action gets received, he thinks that agents always act on patience, and the way that the patient is conditioned by certain forms is also going to impact how the effect is manifested from the agent's power. So I think we have to think of the powers of agents as being maybe more generic than your example suggested, because you're already specifying the effect there And the effects kind of aren't solely determined by the agent's power, but the whole network of causes and the patient, especially how it's receiving the causality. Thank you.
Over here. Thank you, Gloria. Thanks for the great talk. It was very interesting and very clear.
Thank you. Your paper is great on this topic, too. Yeah.
Thanks. I was as you were talking about Thomas's view on the natural causes, in my mind, I was thinking something to support your reading was his account of evil, that evil always needs a cause, right? Because what's bad is contrary to the tendency of the thing, the natural tendency of the thing, so there has to be some obstacle impeding the tendency, right? But I think that also applies, he wants that also to apply to moral evil, right? That there can't be, if there were no impediment at all, then the agent would always act according to reason, especially if he has virtue, if he or she has virtue. The impediment there is, there's a little bit of a twist. The impediment would be some kind of temptation, or what he calls an inclination to a commutable good, right? Which the will is free to follow that rather than act according to reason, okay? If there were no such thing, then it would simply act according to reason. But the difference is that it's free. It's not absolutely impeded by the temptation. It can resist the temptation. It can go either way, but there is a cause for its going one way rather than the other. There's no cause at all.
Yeah,
seems to me.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's really helpful because I think, with the will, you have to walk a fine line between maintaining freedom, but also maintaining the view that actions are for reasons and that they're not random or by chance. So thank you. I'll have to look into that and build that in here too.
Thanks, Gloria. So I don't like coming to DeConnick's defense, so don't interpret me as doing that. I'm just a little bit puzzled by the setup, right? So
Right.
maybe I've just always read him wrong, but I had always interpreted the passages that you quoted from DeConnick as him expositing what you have labeled under section 2 as the second of the three factors that Aquinas gives in SCG 373. But namely how causes and effects can fail on account of the indisposition of matter. But the way that you presented it looks like you're presenting him as trying to explain, giving like a different theory of the weakness of the agent. So just can you talk me through that?
Yeah, so the reason I was thinking about it that way is because, like in the passage, I think he talks. I'm sorry, I don't have it right here. That he talks about agents being like not achieving their effect. So I thought the passage made reference to the agent. So I wasn't thinking of it as being about the indisposition of the patient's matter. So he says the margin of indetermination in the composite can cause it to lack or achieve an effect. So I thought that was a reference to the agent, because the agent is what, kind of achieves the effect rather than the patient. So that's why I was reading it that way. But I'm sure your point is fair, because he's not really, like in these papers, he's not kind of putting it into the scheme that I am, and I had to do some interpretation. And the reason I wanted to bring him into the paper is to show that, it's not just that Stephen Mumford, a contemporary philosopher, is reading Aquinas this way, but there's like a tradition of historical authors who read him in that way. In Father Brock's paper, he talks about some Italian authors who also think are reading Aquinas in this way, that it's kind of like natural causes can just randomly fail. So I just think it gives the paper a little bit more meat and interest to historical scholars to show that it's, there are ways of reading Aquinas, but I'll take your point into consideration, certainly, to make sure I've read it.
Thanks, Gloria. That was great. I was wondering about how to think about impediment. So I was wondering about a case where God fails to concur with the effect.
Yeah.
Does that count as an impediment?
I would think of that as like more of like a case where a lack of condition, a necessary condition. So I think a lack of something isn't ever going to be an impediment, but just the absence of a condition. But yeah, it is a little harder to think about God's. I still don't think it would be an impediment, but it isn't as if God's just a a condition like other conditions in the world. I mean, Aquinas thinks that creatures are acting in virtue of God's power, so it's more like, that when the hammer doesn't nail anything because no one picked it up and hit it, I wouldn't be like, oh, it's just a lack of a necessary condition. It's like, a whole different type of, absence of something that creatures need for causality.
Okay, hi. That wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
I just need some more illumination on or clarification on the claim that Aristotle and Aquinas don't have the same sense of virtue as have the same strength. That for Aristotle, the virtuous person cannot fail, and that for Aquinas, virtues are just an inclination. And the text that you use to support your understanding of Aquinas is that someone possessing a habit might not use it. There are habits virtue is a habit, but not all habits are virtues. So is he talking about virtue in that, the line that someone possessing a habit? I mean, I can see times where the virtuous person might stumble, let's say if they're sick or something, and a new movement of passion or emotion or weakness is in their system that they haven't dealt with before. Let's say to being whiny or crabby or something. Before that, they've always had a just approach to things. So I'm just wondering if they really do differ in this, and if you've got more evidence than that line.
Yeah, I mean, I guess since I'm more interested in the natural causation and modality, I'm basically just taking, other scholars' work on this area, mainly relying on Bonnie Kent's work on this. And I think Father Brock's comment is helpful, that when a virtuous agent fails to use a virtue, it's not just going to be out of nowhere, but it'll be like a case where there's some impediment there, like, not feeling well or something like that. But I think it is Aquinas' view that it lies in will, that it's not that having a sickness determines the person not to use their virtue, that it's also a choice of the will. And I take it, just building off of other scholars' work, that the common reading of Aristotle is that even if you're dead sick, if you don't act virtuously or act against a virtue, it means you just don't have it. Whereas Aquinas maybe has a more realistic understanding of virtue and moral agency, that it will allow for cases where someone can genuinely be virtuous, but because maybe of some other factors that are going on, they choose not to use a virtue.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, but let's thank Gloria. Now, barring any impediment, our next speaker, Zita Toth, will act very powerfully on all of us. Zita is a lecturer in philosophy at King's College London. Her research is mainly on metaphysical issues such as causation, creation, theories of matter, from the early scholastics to the mid-14th century. And the title of her talk is Little Soul's Great Aims, the Role of Teleology in Aquinas' Theory of Causal Powers. Let's welcome Zita.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, also for organizing this terrific conference so far. Right, so the main question this paper is addressing is very simple, or can be put very simply. What do final causes do exactly in Aquinas' theory of causal powers? And I don't have to introduce that theory because Gloria has just really nicely done so, but if you think that causes act by their active powers on certain patients with the relevant passive powers, and this action is in some ways necessary, however we flesh that out, that kind of necessity. What else exactly do we need to explain for the reason that we introduce final causes? And there is some current disagreement on this, and I don't have time to recapitulate the whole debate. I do want to say, though, and I'm really glad that Gloria is here, because her book, which is a really great book, I really strongly recommend it, gives an account which, well, as we will see, I don't find entirely plausible. So basically what she says is something like that the presence of the fire causal power doesn't alone explain why fire actually burns flammable things, just as having the power of will alone doesn't explain why voluntary agents act in particular ways. So according to Gloria, at least in the book, natural inclinations are analogous to the will in rational agents. And of course, Aquinas does say things like that, so I put it on the handout. This is text 1. I'm not going to read it. But I think this account is a little bit, first of all, it's quite vague, but it also makes Aquinas to be a quite feasible target of some early modern critiques, which of course doesn't mean that it's not the right interpretation, but I'm trying to see if there is something more that we can say about this. So I just put Descartes and Malebranche on here, and I think I'm not going to worry about Descartes, but I really like this Malebranche quote, so I'm going to read this. This is from the dialogue. Well then, let's suppose that this chair can move itself. Which way will it go? With what velocity? At what time will it take it into its head to move? You would have to give the chair an intellect and will capable of determining itself. You would have, in short, to make a man out of your armchair. So the criticism is quite clear. So what can we say to this, or how can we understand these natural tendencies in some perhaps some way that would avoid this sort of worry? And I'm not going to read the Aristotle passage, but it's a very well-known passage from the Physics where Aristotle argues for final causes. I am going to read the parallel passage from Aquinas, which is quite long, but interestingly, it doesn't really feature in the, or at least to my knowledge, in the discussions on final causation, but I think it should because it's a really interesting text. So the context here is divine providence, and Aquinas raises the objection that, well, divine providence is sort of the ordering of things according to their ends, but of course there are people who don't believe in ends, so what can we say to them? And here is what he says to them. So this is text number 5 on the handout, and I'm just going to read the whole thing, even though it's a little bit long. So material and efficient causes as such cause only the existence of their effects. They are not sufficient to produce goodness in them. Heat, for example, of its very nature and of itself, can break down other things, but this breaking down is good and helpful only if it happens up to a certain point and in a certain way. Consequently, if we do not admit that there exist in nature causes other than heat and similar agents, we cannot give any reason why things happen in a good and orderly way. Moreover, whatever does not have a determinate cause happens by accident. Consequently, if the position mentioned above were true, namely that there are no final causes, all the explanation, all the harmony and usefulness found in things would be the result of chance. This explanation, of course, is absurd, for those things that happen by chance happen only rarely. We know from experience, however, that harmony and usefulness are found in nature either at all times or at least for the most part. This cannot be the result of mere chance. It must be, therefore, because an end is intended. So, right, so I think Aquinas thinks that final causes account for two observable features of the universe, and the observability is important here. I think there is in later scholasticism that became sort of its own issue, whether we can observe final causes. I think Aquinas thinks that we can observe final causes, at least we can observe the results of final causes. And so one of the features, observable features, is that is the fact that things happen in a good and orderly way, as he puts it. And then the second feature is that this goodness and orderliness is regular. So it happens always or for the most part. So I will start with point 2 because perhaps that's the easier one. Of course, we know, so you may think, well, okay, that's a bit weird because if efficient causal powers act by necessity, then of course orderliness or regularity is not something that you have to explain by some other means. But I think it's good to recall that we are talking here about sort of chance in the Aristotelian sense, so by sort of unintended confluence of causal chains. And so the claim here is that if things happen by chance, they just don't happen for the most part. So Aristotle's example is the digging in your yard and finding a treasure. That doesn't happen very often, even though it's determined by the confluence of the two causal series. But of course, the question is, well, what kind of goodness or orderliness do we observe in the universe that would require this kind of explanation? And I think, Aquinas doesn't really elaborate on this here. I think there are two things that he may have in mind. He does point to these a little bit at least. It seems that natural processes know some kind of limit, so they are bounded. And of course, Aristotle has this argument in the De Anima, but I'm not going to rehash it here. So the idea is that limited and ordered processes cannot be accounted for by material principles alone. And so that seems to be one feature. And the other feature, which I think is important, is that efficient causes are sort of well coordinated. So they active and passive powers, for instance, tend to match. And that will be, I think, an important implication. And this is, I think, confirmed, which I'm not, well, no, I'm going to read it. Sorry, it's text 6 on the handout. Where Aquinas says that every agent acts for an end. Otherwise, one thing would not follow more than another from the action of the agent unless it were by chance. And so why not? I think presumably because the agent's causal powers would not be properly determined to their effects. And perhaps there would be no matching of the active and passive powers. And Aquinas makes a very similar point in the fifth way, which of course is a very famous passage, and we can read it. I think it makes some pertinent points that are sometimes overlooked here. So this is handout 7. He says, we see some things that lack knowledge, namely natural bodies, act for the sake of some end. This is apparent from the fact that they always or most often act in the same way so as to attain what is best. From this, it is obvious that they achieve their end not by chance, but by intention. And then he goes on to say that those things that lack knowledge must do this because some intentional agent has determined them to do so. So here we see, usually, the way the 5 ways work is Aquinas identifies some explanatory gap, and then he fills it with either the first mover or some with God in general. Here, I think it's important that we see two gaps. So there is a gap first because he wants to explain why it is that things don't act by chance. So why is it that things act regularly? And then the second gap seems to be that how is it that things that lack cognition still act for an end? And I think this is important because this second point is quite often disregarded, and I think it really pertains to Aquinas' framework that we cannot make sense of final causation without positing God, for the better or for worse for the contemporary discussion. So what does this mean? So I'm not going to, there is also, I think, a confirming passage I think it's passage 9 in the handout, on the handout. I'm not going to read that. But what does this mean with respect to our question of what final causes do? I think, so the way I asked the question at the beginning was a little bit misleading because I said having all the efficient causes in place, efficient causal powers in place, what is it that we still need to explain by final causes? And I think the question is misleading because you cannot, it seems that on this account, you just cannot posit the causal powers without already referencing final causes. Because it seems that, so if you ask the question, why does fire tend to heat? Now, one answer is, of course, by reference to its heating power, which is a fairly standard answer. Fire tends to heat because it has its heating power. But in the second step, I think Aquinas would say that the heating power is a heating power as opposed to a cooling power, for instance, based on its endpoint. And he's, in other contexts, for instance, when he talks about sensation, he also explicitly says that powers are individuated based on their termini. So you can't individuate an efficient causal power without referencing its endpoint, its final cause. So in this view, it seems that powers are of a particular kind because of their endpoints. And of course, there is the further question that Aquinas asks. So if we really want to explain why fire has this power to heat always or for the most part, we need to refer to its place in the ordered universe. So it seems that, and this is, I mean, I don't think this is a very surprising result because it's already in Aristotle, but I think Aquinas agrees here that final causes have a double role. So they have an intrinsic and an extrinsic role, and the intrinsic role is what fixes the determination of the efficient causal power. And then the extrinsic role is what places the certain kind of cause somewhere in the ordered universe, including also or ensuring that it can bring about its effect because it sort of meets the right kind of passive power in the order. So I think there are a few implications here that are worth mentioning. So I think, first of all, it gives a fairly good explanation of why Aquinas thinks, and again, this is of course very Aristotelian, why he thinks that final causes are explanatory prior to efficient causes. Because I think if we think that the final and efficient causal frameworks are sort of independent from one another, it's very difficult to make sense of this explanatory priority. But I think in this model, I mean, the claim is that sort of final causes explain why things have the efficient causal powers to start with. We cannot make sense of these efficient causal powers without final causes. So we cannot have a full account of efficient causation without reference to final causes, and also, as we saw in the fifth way, actually without reference to God. So basically, I think Aquinas' theory of powers presupposes both his teleological and theological framework. Another implication, so there have been some attempts recently, which I didn't get into the interpretative debates here very much, but to give a sort of very stripped down version of Aquinas' notion of final causes, according to which even inertial motion would count as sort of teleologically ordered. I don't think that's a very plausible. So basically, that account says that it's only the intrinsic function that really matters for Aquinas. I just don't think that's supported by the text, because every single time Aquinas argues for final causes, he brings in this notion of goodness and providence. So I think that's important in the account. Now, to come back to the natural and voluntary agent distinction, which I think is really interesting. I think so. This gives Aquinas a quite neat way to distinguish natural and voluntary agents in the model. And I think the distinction is that, as we saw, for natural agents, the final cause is sort of built in to the causal power. But in the case of the will, it seems that it's not. So the will can, of course, determine itself, and the final cause is extrinsic to it. But in the case of natural agents, we have a final cause that's sort of built in. And so this also means that, well, if we go back to Malebranche's objection, we don't really have the little souls, right? I mean, we have a big soul, God, who orders things in the providential manner, but it's not that every single object has to sort of deliberate on its action or determine its action. And this also means that, instead of sort of anthropomorphizing natural agents, I think Aquinas understands final causes in somewhat different ways in natural and voluntary things. Right. So the last thing I wanted to argue here or point out that I think this reading also gives Aquinas a way to deal with an objection that was quite prominent in the early modern period, but it was also raised quite recently by a couple of people. Walter Toth formulates it quite pointedly, and I think I put on the handout. Oh no, I put Neil Williams on the handout. Anyway, the objection is what has been called the problem of fit, is the question of how do or why do active and passive powers match. And so the way I think Williams puts it is that if you imagine a puzzle factory where there are 100 people working, and everyone makes just one little piece of the puzzle without coordinating with one another. And what's the chance that there is a meaningful puzzle resulting at the end? It's very minimal, right? But it seems that at least in the case of active and passive powers, they seem to match. And if we don't posit something that would explain this matching, it's really surprising. Why would, and I think Walter Toth says this, right, why does the power of fire to burn paper never run across paper with the power to turn into a chicken when encountering fire? Right, so like what would happen? And I think in some way, Aquinas, I think, agrees with this objection. Because he thinks that if you only consider the causal powers, it is quite surprising that they match, and you have to invoke final causation in order to explain why they do. So in some ways, this gives Aquinas a reason to posit final causes. We can talk about this more maybe, but I'm going to wrap up here because we are sort of out of time. So I just wanted to offer, this was not really a surprising point perhaps, but I wanted to offer an interpretation of Aquinas in this paper according to which final causes play this double role. I think it's neat because you sort of see how essential final causes are for Aquinas. And I mean, this is also, so I think there is a tendency today, and that also applies to me, because I never really worked on final causes. We tend to sort of separate the efficient causal model, causal powers problems from final causes, which are a bit suspect anyway. But I just don't think that can be really done if this is correct reading. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zita. And as I open it up to questions, I just can't help remarking as the moderator the deep connection between the first two papers, and especially if you take text 5 very seriously, that it seems to be the final causality that's responsible for the fact that things have to act in the way that Gloria is describing, because it's the material and efficient causality that describes their being, but not the self-diffusive continuing to, right, and it's the final causality that sort of locks nature in a really interesting way that we might associate with efficient causality. So I really thank you for that. We have about 10 minutes, so okay, I'm going to start with Michael. You can blow this all up. Okay, good.
Hi, thanks very much. This is just a simple clarification question. About 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, you distinguished in an intrinsic and an extrinsic role. For fun. Could you? I think I understood the intrinsic one, but could you just give us that contrast again? Because I know I didn't get what you meant by the extrinsic one.
So maybe these are not very fortunate names. I just couldn't come up with anything better. By the extrinsic, I meant I think it's extrinsic in actually two different ways. The first, so I call it intrinsic because it's not very fortunate to say that final causes act, but so anyway, in that sense they explain part of the nature of the substance, why it has the causal powers it has, or why those causal powers are the causal powers they are. That's a better way to put it, perhaps. And the extrinsic is extrinsic because it's sort of is directed not to the substance itself, but to the order of the universe, or the providential order. I don't know. Does this make sense?
So it's extrinsic and the intrinsic determines which power we attribute to the agent, and the extrinsic is like what result is going to happen out there.
Yeah, but the extrinsic sort of places the agent in the overall order of creation. And I think, Aquinas says, and I think Professor Taverde quoted the same passage yesterday in the talk, that the providential order is it's imprinted and is manifest in the various tendencies that things have. So I think it's extrinsic in that sense, that it's not directed to the agent itself, but to the whole.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And you might have actually sort of answered this at the end of your answer to Dr. Gorman, but sometimes I hear people kind of say that final cause, we should just understand it as like the formal cause doing its thing. So I wonder if you can maybe help me understand, is it the extrinsicality of the final cause that makes it necessary apart from just formal cause?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think, of course there is the sort of easy answer, but I don't think it's very informative, that formal causes are intrinsic causes and final causes aren't. But I think what a formal cause does, so I don't think, so a formal cause may explain, why. So the form of fire may be responsible for the fire to have its causal powers in some way. But what I'm trying to say is that if you try to specify the identity of these causal powers, that's when you have to refer to final cause. And I don't think the formal cause of the fire itself will fix that. I hope that makes sense.
Give it to Father Raphael, Mary, and then Stephen.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I wonder, so I've always thought of final causes in living things as being kind of almost conceptually built in, that the flourishing of a living thing, like it's just clear that it's good for the tree to be green and not good for it to turn brown and wilt. And it seems like what you're saying is that that's the same thing for non-living things, is that the final cause is almost built into is really built into the concept of the efficient cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And with living thing, it's tricky, because I think once you have rationality, it will change things. Or more precise, if you have free will, that will change things, because then you don't have this fixity of the end point. It's complicated because there is the willing of happiness, which may or may not be determined.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Zita. So I've got a question about just how strong you want your argument to be. So at one point, I think you said something like, we can't understand the efficient causes without reference to the final causes. And then you further said that we couldn't understand the final causes without reference to God. But, like text 5 and text 7 look like they give you arguments for those moves. And so if it's understood in the sense of you can't even understand what an efficient cause is without the notion of a final cause being built into it, as Father Raphael just said, then why would you need to make these kinds of arguments? And if there's if you mean something weaker than with reference to or built into the concept, then I wonder if you think both of those two moves have the same strength, like the link between efficient and final causes, and then the link between final causes and God.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, so when I say you can't understand, that's a bit ambiguous, because I think maybe Aquinas could say that, it's evident in se, but not quod nos, and so you have to actually present an argument for why that's the claim. I think, but my claim wasn't really meant to be. I didn't really mean it in the epistemological. I mean, it's more a metaphysical claim that I think the concept of efficient causes presupposes the concept of final cause, but maybe that's not obvious, so you have to actually argue for it, if that makes sense. And I think I would say the same thing about the other gap.
Thanks, Zita. This was super interesting. And my question goes back to Jane's question about forms. So what I was wondering is, so the line that you give us takes us from efficient causes, goes back to final causes, and final causes go back to God. But I kind of want to push on this idea that form is part of the mix somewhere. And particularly, I think with the text that you cited on text 5, when he gives the example of heat, where he says this breaking down is good and helpful only if it happens up to a certain point and in a certain way. So he's specifically thinking there of living creatures which are using heat to do something that's beneficial to them, like digestion. But there isn't any limit on heat in a natural substance except just the amount of heat that a fire happens to have. It's a small fire, so it has less heat, and a bigger fire has more heat. But he needs to have this notion of limit in place so that when your body is cooking your food, it's not going to burn itself up while it's trying to transform the food into your own body. And that seems to relate back then to the form that's setting this limit for the substance. So I just want to sort of push on this idea that form plays some important role there in setting the end as a kind of intermediary between the final cause and God.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, and thank you. So I was puzzled by this as well, because I mean the sort of the argument in, where is that, De Anima 2, 3, 2,
it's
right,
two,
or wherever that is. Sorry, is exactly that. Yeah, you need the soul as a substantial form in order to account for the limited qualities or processes of the living body. And so how would that work in the case of just a natural body? And I think that's a really good point, that maybe you have to invoke formal causes in order to I guess as a sort of I think you put it very well, this intermediary between final and efficient. I need to think more about that, but that's really helpful. Thank you.
But I think that complements what you said. It's not at all an objection, because even in the inanimate case, although the form doesn't set a limit, it will specify. So the gold will be conductive rather than not conductive.
Right.
So it's still gonna.
Yeah.
It's gonna help. Okay, I think we're out of time here, but let's thank Zita once again. One of the really lovely things about hosting this conference has been the great variety of fans of Aquinas that we've had. Last night, many of us had the pleasure of enjoying the hillbilly Thomist. Today, we have a self-described Boilermaker Thomist. I wouldn't have attributed that unless he had done so himself first. And Jeff Brower really needs no introduction. He's a professor of philosophy at Purdue. His research is in Aquinas' natural philosophy, metaphysics, and philosophical theology. And now I guess I've overdetermined it because I said he needed no introduction, and then I introduced him. But to get myself off the stage as quickly as possible, his paper title will be Medieval Theories of External Relations, Aquinas as a Case Study. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, David, and boiler up. So I want to jump right into things. So consider two spherical objects in close proximity, say two marbles separated by a distance of 2 centimeters. And with my massive Microsoft Word skills, I've drawn you a picture of this under A on the handout. Such objects obviously stand in various relations to each other. In particular, they stand in the relations of being similar in shape and at a distance of 2 centimeters. But note that there appears to be an important difference between their similarity and distance relations, for their similarity appears to be grounded in, or to hold in virtue of, their shapes, which are intrinsic features of the marbles. By contrast, the distance between the marbles does not appear to be grounded in any of their intrinsic features, much less in their shapes. Indeed, the distance between the marbles does not appear to hold in virtue of any of their features, intrinsic or otherwise. Hereafter, I'll mark the distinction between these two types of relation by saying the first, similarity in shape, is an internal relation, whereas the second, being at a distance of 2 centimeters, is an external relation. More generally, I shall say that a relation R is internal if it's grounded in intrinsic features of its relata, and external otherwise. There's a distinction in medieval philosophy corresponding to the one I've just drawn between internal and external relations. Medieval philosophers in the Latin West inherit from Boethius a division of Aristotle's 10 categories into 2 groups. Those which are absolute, where these include the first 3 categories, substance, quantity, and quality, and those which are relative, where these include the remaining 7 categories, relation, action, passion, when, where, position, and habit. And you can see this at B on the handout. By the mid-13th century, it was customary for these same philosophers to assume both, 1, that all of the relative categories include relative accidents of some type, and 2, that only accidents falling in the specific Aristotelian category of relation are grounded in intrinsic features of their relata. Now, all of this is well known to scholars of medieval philosophy, and there have been important studies devoted to medieval theories of action, medieval theories of certain external relations, in particular action and passion. Even so, there has yet to appear in the secondary literature any systematic treatment of medieval theories of external relations as such. What's more, the specific external relations on which scholars have focused are what we might call weakly external relations. That is, relations that are still grounded in features of their relata, even if they're not grounded in intrinsic features of them. As a result, questions remain about what, if anything, medieval philosophers have to say about strongly external relations. That is, relations that aren't grounded in any features of their relata. In this paper, I begin the project of exploring medieval theories of external relations by examining in some detail what one medieval philosopher, my hero, Thomas Aquinas, has to say about what's now regarded as a paradigmatic example of a strongly external relation, namely spatial location, or the relation that holds between a body and the place at which it's located. The full paper has 3 different parts. I'm only going to have time to touch on the first 2. That is Aquinas' views about the nature and ontology of spatial location. So part 1. Aquinas' views about the nature of spatial location emerge most clearly in contexts where he's discussing locomotion. That is, a type of change that something undergoes when it changes its place, or its spatial location, or where it exists. As when a bird flies through the air or a ball rolls across the room. Indeed, as I shall now attempt to show, in contexts where Aquinas is discussing locomotion, he commits himself to the view that spatial location is not only a type of relation, but a strongly external one. At text 1, this is T1 on the handout, I've included a passage in which Aquinas compares locomotion, which he there calls change of place, with 2 other types of change, namely augmentation and diminution, and alteration. In the interest of time, I'm not actually going to read any of the passages. But if you look at that passage at T1, you'll see that Aquinas begins it by identifying a requirement on change as such. He says all change requires both a subject, that is something that's changed, and some termini, that is some things with respect to which the subject changes. Aquinas then goes on in the passage to illustrate how this requirement is met in 3 familiar types of change, what he calls locomotion, augmentation and diminution, and alteration. In each of Aquinas' example, the subject of change is the same. It's an ordinary physical substance or body. In the case of locomotion, it goes from here to there. In the case of augmentation and diminution, it goes from one size to another. And in the case of alteration, it goes from one qualitative state to another. By contrast, in each of these examples, the termini for change are different. Indeed, it's precisely because the termini for locomotion are places that Aquinas refers to locomotion itself as change of place. And it's precisely because the termini for the other 2 types are quantities and qualities that he refers to them respectively as augmentation and diminution on the one hand and alteration on the other. As is well known, Aquinas thinks of quantities and qualities as different types of accidental form. For the same reason, he's happy to speak of augmentation and diminution and alteration as changes of form, in which the subject plays the role of their matter. Now, it might be tempting to suppose that Aquinas thinks of place as a type of accidental form, and hence that he would be happy to speak of locomotion as a change of form as well. But in fact, this is not the case. On the contrary, Aquinas explicitly contrasts changes of place with changes of form. And here I direct you to the passage at T2. The passage at T2, the last couple sentences that begin with consequently should be indented. That's supposed to be another paragraph. This is a complicated passage, and even more so since I don't have time to read it. But if you look at the first and final paragraphs, you'll see that the main point of the passage is to establish the conclusion that place is something, aliquid. In fact, if you look at the last couple sentences, you'll see its purpose is to establish that place is a type of receptacle, receptaculum, that is distinct from any of the things located at it. Then, if you look at the middle two paragraphs, you'll see that Aquinas' strategy for establishing this conclusion, that place is a kind of receptacle, is to reflect on how changes of place differ from changes of form. So I mentioned a moment ago that Aquinas takes every change to involve both a subject and some termini. In the second paragraph, he begins by telling us that in changes of form, the termini are forms, forms that are successively received by a subject, where the subject in turn serves as their matter. For matter, he tells us there, is, quote, a subject in which forms can succeed one another, unquote. In changes of place, by contrast, he says the termini are places rather than forms, and instead of being successively received by the subject is successively received by them. For places, he tells us, are, quote, something where bodies can succeed one another. In changes of place, therefore, it's not the subject of change that does the receiving, but the termini. To clarify the contrast that Aquinas is drawing here, consider first a change in which Socrates goes from being healthy to sick. In this sort of change, we have a subject, namely Socrates, successively receiving different forms, namely the qualities of health and sickness, and thereby serving as the matter in which these forms succeed one another. Now contrast this change with one in which Socrates goes from one place to another, say from his house to the marketplace. In this latter sort of change, we don't have a subject that successively receives different forms, as if places were forms that could be received. Instead, we have places that successively receive Socrates, and in principle could receive other bodies. Now, obviously, a place cannot receive Socrates or any other body in the same way that matter receives a form. For when matter receives a form, it does so by having the form inhere in it. But bodies are substances, and hence can't inhere in anything. So, how does a place receive a body, if not by inherence? The short answer is by location. For just as matter receives a form when that form inheres in it, so too a place receives a body when that body is located at it. Interestingly, in the final paragraph of T2, we get a glimpse of how Aquinas is thinking of location itself. For there he identifies places with receptacles, or containers as he more often calls them, which suggests that he's thinking of places as receiving bodies in the way that receptacles or containers receive their contents, namely by being filled by them. And indeed, Aquinas confirms elsewhere that he thinks of location in terms of filling, and you can see that if you look at passages T3 and T4. If all this is right, then changes of place must be understood for Aquinas not in terms of a subject successively receiving different forms, but in terms of a subject successively filling different receptacles of some type. Aquinas' views about the nature of the relevant type of receptacle are complicated, but fortunately the details need not detain us here. For our purposes, it's enough to emphasize that he takes changes of place to be very different from changes of form, precisely because the termini for changes of place are not forms of the changing body, but entities that can be filled by them. Now, as it happens, it's a short step from here to the conclusion that spatial location is a relation for Aquinas. And I've tried to indicate why with this little argument from receptacle filling at D on the handout. The first premise of this argument appears to be analytic, at least for Aquinas. For to be spatially located, esse locatum, just is to have a locus, or a place. As for the second premise, it would appear to follow straightforwardly from what I've just said about Aquinas' views about locomotion. Finally, it's hard to see how anyone could deny the third premise. Indeed, given that Aquinas thinks of places as receptacles, wholly distinct from the bodies that fill them, it's hard to see how he could deny that spatial location is just a relation to a place. At this point, however, we have to be careful, for Aquinas doesn't typically use the term relation, relatio, in connection with spatial location. On the contrary, he tends to use this term only in a narrow or technical sense to refer to accidents specifically falling within the Aristotelian category of relation. In this sense, of course, spatial location is not a relation. Even so, it must be noted that, like later medieval philosophers, Aquinas is perfectly happy, at least on occasion, to use the term relation in a broader sense to refer to accidents falling in any of the last 7 categories, and in particular in the category of when, which you can see if you look at T5 on the handout. As all of this makes clear, the term relation is ambiguous for Aquinas, and we must be careful how we understand it in connection with his views about spatial location. For although spatial location doesn't qualify as a relation for him in the narrow technical sense, it does qualify for him as a relation in the broad intuitive sense. And hereafter, I'm just going to use relation in the broad sense. So far, I've been arguing that Aquinas takes spatial location to be a relation, at least in the broad sense. I now want to extend my argument to show that Aquinas takes this same relation to be a strongly external one. To do so, however, I need to highlight a further aspect of Aquinas' views about locomotion. Aquinas takes locomotion to be one of 4 main types of change. In principle, he allows for as many types of change as there are Aristotelian categories, so 10 in total. But like Aristotle himself, he typically focuses on changes associated with just 4 categories, namely substance, quality, quantity, and where. Indeed, like Aristotle, Aquinas takes changes associated with these 4 categories to be the only per se types of change, and he introduces special names to mark them. And we've seen 3 of these, but you can check out the first item under E on the handout. In describing these 4 types of change as per se, Aquinas means to contrast them with the types of change associated with the remaining categories, which he describes as per accidens. By a per se change, Aquinas just has in mind a change that isn't grounded in other changes. That is, one that can occur without the occurrence of any other changes. By contrast, a per accidens change is one that's grounded in other changes and hence can't occur apart from other changes. You can see this if you look at what he says in text T6 about changes in the specific category of relation. Things in this category are per accidens, or changes in that category are per accidens because they can't occur apart from other changes. If things change in their similarity relations, it has to be because they change in their qualitative. There has to be a qualitative change. They change in their qualities. Okay, all of this turns out to be directly relevant to understanding Aquinas' views about the nature of spatial location. For insofar as Aquinas identifies locomotion as a type of per se change, he is committed to denying that it's grounded in other changes. But if that's right, then he would also seem to be committed to denying that spatial location itself is grounded in features of its relata. For if spatial location were so grounded, then there'd have to be some features of its relata on which the relation supervenes, or which were sufficient for the relation to hold. But in that case, no changes in spatial location could occur apart from changes in the features in question. Indeed, in that case, changes in spatial location would be like changes in the specific category of relation. That is to say, they would be grounded in other changes precisely because the relations themselves are grounded in other features. In short, Aquinas' views about the per seity of locomotion appear to commit him to each of the premises of the following argument. And this is at, where is this? E on the handout? Oh, yeah. And from here, it immediately follows that spatial location is a strongly external relation. For as I noted at the outset, a relation counts as strongly external, just in case it's not grounded in any features of its relata. Okay, part 2. Having examined Aquinas' views about the nature of spatial location, I now want to briefly turn to his understanding of its ontology. And here I'll argue that Aquinas commits himself to a distinctive form of realism. Nowadays, it's standard to identify relations with polyadic properties, or at least to think of them in this way. That is, as properties that can belong to two or more subjects at a time. But Aquinas explicitly rejects this identification. For like other medieval philosophers, he takes relations to be accidents and explicitly denies that accidents can belong to more than one subject at a time. You can see this if you look at text T7. It's tempting to think that if spatial location cannot be identified with any type of polyadic property, then it must be identified with some type of monadic property, that is, one that can belong to just one subject at a time. But Aquinas seems to reject this identification as well, for evidently, if spatial location were a property of any type, it would have to be a type of form. In particular, one that's received by an object when it undergoes locomotion. But as I shall now attempt to show, Aquinas denies that there are any forms that the subject undergoing locomotion receives. Aquinas' views about the relationship of locomotion to forms, or form reception, emerges most clearly in contexts where he's discussing angelic causation. For in such contexts, Aquinas is at pains to establish two things, both one, that locomotion is a type of change that angels can produce in bodies, and two, that they can do so only because locomotion does not involve the reception of any type of form. And here I direct you to the passage at T8. Aquinas begins this passage by explaining why angels must be capable of exercising causal power over bodies, namely because of the superiority of their nature. He hastens to add, however, that the way in which bodies are subject to angelic power is, quote, is not, quote, with respect to the reception of forms, unquote, but only, quote, with respect to locomotion, unquote. And this is precisely because locomotion, he says, and here again I quote, does not require the positing of any form in what is moved, unquote. I wish I had more time to talk about that, but there's obviously much more that could be said, but I think passages like T8 help to make clear that in the context of his treatment of angelic causation, Aquinas commits himself to each of the premises of the indented argument at G. This is 2a through 2. Basically that angels can't produce changes in bodies that involve reception of forms, but they can produce some changes in bodies, in particular locomotion, so locomotion doesn't involve the reception of any forms. But as I noted earlier, if spatial location were a property of some type, it would have to be a type of form that's received in locomotion, but since Aquinas denies the existence of any such forms, spatial location can't be identified for him with a property of any type, whether monadic or polyadic. Now, in spite of denying that spatial location can be identified with any type of form or property, Aquinas insists that it must be understood as a mind-independent feature of objects. Indeed, as he sees it, this is a straightforward consequence of his views about the categories, and in particular, the fact that spatial location must be understood in terms of accidents falling in the Aristotelian category of where. For as you'll see if you look at T10, he thinks nothing's placed in any category unless it's something existing outside the soul. But all of this raises a puzzle. If spatial location is a mind-independent feature that can't be understood in terms of any type of form or property, how is it to be understood? I think Aquinas' own preferred answer to this question would be, quote, as a specific mode of being, unquote. For this is how he thinks of the Aristotelian categories themselves, namely as 10 distinct modes of being, modi essendi, corresponding to 10 distinct modes of predicating, modi predicandi. And you can see this if you look at T11. Aquinas' identification of the Aristotelian categories with distinct modes of being helps, I think, to make sense of how he's thinking of the relations that an object bears to a place. For a mode of being is presumably just a way, a modus, something can be. And although ways of being may, in some cases, be understood in terms of entities or beings, say substances or accidental forms, they need not always be so understood. Indeed, there have been many philosophers historically who have insisted that relations in particular must be understood as primitive modes of being. What all of this suggests is that Aquinas' views about spatial location represent a distinctive form of realism, one that we might call non-ontic realism, and contrast it with more familiar views about spatial location, as I have at the first item under H. So I argue that Aquinas isn't an anti-realist about spatial location, where this would be the view that spatial location is a mind-dependent entity. He's not what I'm here calling an ontic realist, that is the view that spatial location is a mind-independent entity. Instead, he's a non-ontic realist, that is, a proponent of the view that spatial location isn't an entity of any type, but rather a primitive, mind-independent mode of being. I wish I had time to say more, but we better stop here for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. As I'm walking to the back, I'll just ask, do we have an 11th category here? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Good. That's good. I was worried.
Great. Thanks for your paper, Jeff. I find myself deeply puzzled about Aquinas' theory of place. So one way to think about sort of like place is sort of like space sort of as a grid, and the place is a particular sort of square in that grid or something like that. But then he talks about objects as like filling places that are not squares, as it turns out, right? So my question is, the only way I can sort of wrap my head around what a place is supposed to be is that it has a particular size and shape that an object sort of occupies. But it's very strange to speak of whatever a place is as something that has sort of a quality or a quantity to it. So please help me out on this.
Thank you. That's a good question. But in this paper, I'm not talking about Aquinas' views about place, and given time, I think I better not. But that's a good question.
Michael, and then Daniel.
Yeah, sorry, but I'm going to follow up on that because I'm not sure you. It seems to me important that you talk about this in this paper because part of your claim is that it's an external relation, right? And that means that it's not grounded in any features of the relata. But I'm just worried about how we know which, whatever, I won't say entity, is the receptacle where, your bicycle is located. And it seems to me, first of all, the receptacle has to be big enough to hold your bicycle. So that sounds like a feature of the receptacle. And there are other reasons, too, which I won't go into, why I just feel like we have to start talking about features of these receptacles.
I see.
At which point it doesn't sound external anymore.
I see. So, yeah, and apologies, Jeremy, maybe I misunderstood your question, but you're pointing out that there's got to be some features that the receptacle and bodies have in order to stand the appropriate relation. They got to be the same size and shape, for example. Yes, but when I said the relations aren't grounded in the features, those features, there are no features such that once you have them all, the relation holds. So there are features that the object must have, but there's no features that explain the holding of the relation. What I wanted to get away from what I wanted to show in the paper was that there are these things, receptacles, that are filled, and I just didn't want to say what Aquinas' view about the receptacles are. They're not regions of space. They have to be understood in terms of the surfaces of surrounding bodies, but that's a really hard thing to explain.
I was wondering what happens in this picture, how to explain symmetric rotation. So a gold sphere rotating. It's not going from place to place. It's moving. It's not just its parts are moving, it's moving. I felt like all the resources I was given, none of them handled this, but presumably it's to be handled like change of place motion. Can you help me out?
So thank you. Circular motion is a special difficulty, even today, but in the context of these medieval discussions, they always talk about change of place first in this sort of intuitive way that locomotion is a change of place, but then once they get the view out on the table, then they say, wait a minute, but what about rotating, say, a rotating sphere? It's moving, but it's not changing place. And then the initial strategy is to say, well, to be in locomotion is a kind of motion that's derivative on having parts that are changing their places. And so the parts of the sphere are changing place, and so you can say that the whole is in locomotion per accidens because the parts are in locomotion per se.
Right, so even if those parts are kind of derivative parts, right? Because I thought it was
Okay, so that's the first strategy. That's the first step in the strategy, and then the second step is, but do they have it? There is a puzzle on Aquinas' specific view. It turns out that strictly speaking, only whole bodies are in places. So there's this puzzle about the parts, and then there's the puzzle about the ontological status of the parts, and so all hell breaks loose, I think.
Cool. So I'm not going to follow up on this. So I have a different worry. So I don't think it calls into question kind of the overall thesis, but it looks to me like your argument from accidents in section 2F, that first premise is only going to be true if we accept your broad definition earlier of relation. And I'm not sure why Aquinas would think that there is anything that corresponds to your definition of the broad sense of relation. And the reason is because it looks like it's not broad enough, right? So you define the broad sense of relation as having to be an accident in one of those 7 non-absolute ones, but it looks like the broad sense of relation for Aquinas is just se habens ad, and more things than accidents have that, right? So matter se habens ad form, right? And we talk, and like later scholastics will talk about that as a transcendental relation, right? You know, an efficient cause se habens ad a final cause, and so I guess I'm just worried that what you're calling the broad sense, which is, it looks like, doing some argumentative work for you, doesn't actually carve anything in Aquinas' theory at the joints.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's good. So I think there is this broad sense that I've mentioned, but there is an even broader one that includes any kinds of things. But here's a quotation from Henry of Ghent, who says, "The 7 categories are commonly called categories of relations," and I feel like in the context of these categorical debates, it is common to use, there's relation in the narrow sense, and then we want a notion of relation or relative that applies to those categories. But you're quite right. In other contexts, maybe even the categories, if you're thinking about inherence, so fair. Thank you.
Okay, I have a comment and a question, so I'll give the comment first. The movement rotation is of special importance in the Platonic tradition. Plato connects it with an entity that has reached such a sort of like perfection that it doesn't need to change, but it's still like more perfect for that thing to have some sort of action of movement, therefore it rotates. So like the heavenly bodies rotate in addition to their movement. I don't remember if the universe itself rotates. And Aquinas encountered this idea of the importance of rotation through Pseudo-Dionysius, who brings it up, I believe, in the Divine Names, but it's been a while since I read the relevant passage, but I think Pseudo-Dionysius connects this sort of movement with the angels in particular, and then arguably Aquinas could have encountered it through at least indirect references to Timaeus. Okay, my question though. I'm going to do what I did after Father Brock's talk and bring up Boethius' De Trinitate. So Boethius does something really interesting in that he argues that the multiplicity of individuals within a species must be brought about by a difference in accidents because there's like no difference in substance or in matter itself between them. And then the accident that Boethius cites as being the reason for individuation, or it's not clear if he's saying that this is the reason or just an example, is location, is place. He says we can imagine 2 men who are exactly the same in every respect, but we can't imagine them as being in the same place. So Aquinas, in his commentary, moves away from using that same example, and he moves towards quantitative dimensions. So he accepts Boethius' conclusion about accidents, but he chooses a different accident. And then, from what I recall, Aquinas seems to believe that it is possible for 2 entities to be in the same place through a miracle, although that couldn't happen naturally. So I'm just wondering if you think that that difference between Boethius and Aquinas as regards location has any relevance for Aquinas' viewpoint on location as your, in regards to your investigations.
Thanks, Rebecca. I do think it's relevant to his views about individuation. I think he would differ from Boethius on the principle of individuation. I do think you're also right that Aquinas is willing to allow for collocation of bodies by miracle, but not otherwise.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. I would like to get clearer on this mode of being that you're proposing as the solution. So when I think of the essay, the accidental essay, or the categorical essay of things, right, I think it's either substantial essay or accidental essay. Accidental essay is the secondary essay that is given to the subject by something, usually some kind of form or other, right? So couldn't one say, so it seems as though there's pressure to say, given the forma.essay general principle, that if I'm going to say that this is a real category, that I need to appeal to some sort of form somewhere in the picture that is making this category apply, right? So not a category necessarily of space, but do we have to deny that relations are a kind of non-absolute form, right? So it seems as though one could say something like, right, it's got the spatial mode of being, locational mode of being, because it has this relational, relative rather than absolute form connecting it to this surrounding body, and that allows me to be an ontic realist. Right? Your argument against that was in the angels thing, but couldn't one say that when Aquinas says forms, that's just a shorthand for absolute forms?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of view you're describing is Scotist, a Scotist type of view. There's a little relative being. I think, I mean, what's kind of interesting is, you know, these little Scotistic relative things, they're one-place properties, but they are kind of extrinsic properties. But I think Aquinas' view, I wasn't able to talk about the angelic location in much detail, but you might wonder, why can't angels cause the perception of forms? He has this funny example where he says, you know, if an angel wanted to make, he doesn't put it this way, but if an angel wanted to make you a cup of tea, it could move the cup close to the fire, and then the fire could heat it. He basically says the angel has to bring some water close to the fire, and it could produce a reception of form indirectly, but it can't directly do that. And there's a question about why that's the case, and I put this passage on the handout. I think it's T9, but basically what he argues in there is, I think he thinks if you had any kind of form, then the reception of that form would produce a compound. And he has this likeness principle that governs efficient causation, and so effects must be like their causes, but he thinks no complex effect could be like an angel. Angels are simple, at least simple substances. He says the one exception is God, which everything resembles. So if something complex is produced, it has to be produced either by God or another compound. So I think that would rule out even your kind of Scotistic reading of Aquinas.
So we can continue questions, but we have about 7 minutes left to ask the entire panel questions. So if you have questions for Gloria or Zita, or questions about how the three papers relate to each other, which I think they do quite nicely, please include those.
This is a question for Professor Brouwer.
Should we all maybe move to here?
You're free to move to the table. That microphone works.
So thank you for your presentation. It's been amazing. This is just to clarify better your view on Aquinas' non-ontic realism. So you said that basically a region of space exists just if there are things which fill them. and that's a primitive relation that things bring with their location or region of space. But so I was thinking that, like, if I have a spherical region in front of me and I feel it, and after an hour I like step aside and my friend Sam feel it the same, are we feeling the same region of space? Since the location is primitive to things, it doesn't look like we are feeling the same region, even though intuitively seems that we are.
So it's hard to think about how to answer this quickly. Aquinas doesn't think there are regions of space, so at neither time do you fill a region of space. But he does think you and your friend, was it Sam, you fill the same place, just at different times.
I've got a question for Gloria and then for Zita. The two questions are related. So, Gloria, when you were talking about weakness of the agent, I was wondering if there's another way to think about some cases of weakness, which has to do with a mismatch between the power of the agent and the resistance in the patient. So you might have, a pot of water that's just too large to heat given how small the flame is or something like that. And then it's not really, there's no impediment in the agent explaining the weakness. It's actually a mismatch between the task that's assigned to it on the side of the patient and the power that the agent has.
Yeah, there's a text where Aquinas talks about size as playing a role, in cases of strength and weakness as well. And I talk about that a little in the version of the paper, the written version. And I say, like that, yeah, that's definitely explaining some cases of weakness and causal failure. And I think we can understand that a little bit more, why that mismatch happens if we understand Aquinas' views on no action at a distance. So he thinks that action only happens at points of contact, and so you can kind of make sense of that. And what's really going on in those cases is, you have a really big body and a really small agent, and so the point of contact is going to be really small in the patient. So I think probably in those cases, what you're having is just the agent making a small effect in a part. And so we think it failed because it didn't heat the whole body of water, but it's heating a very small part. And so that's going to be, certain cases. So I've kind of left those aside to focus on cases where you don't have that type of mismatch. You have a sufficient, range of contact between agent and patient, but you still don't have an effect. And my goal was just to argue that there is some impediment in the agent that explains it, that it's not that these things just come about randomly because of just the constitution of material things being such that they just sometimes spontaneously fail.
Thanks. And then connected with that, for Zita, so right at the end of the paper, you talked about the problem of fit, and how odd it is that the active and passive powers don't come disconnected from each other. But I thought that maybe one resource that the Aristotelian system has that Aquinas can draw on to answer that kind of concern is that the active and passive powers are for one and the same thing, which is the motion or the change. So I'm wondering if you think that kind of approach can help with the kind of worry that you put forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, and whether. So there, yeah. I don't think that everyone in the medieval period thought that there was this identity between active and passive power. So yeah, maybe that can help. I mean, there are complicating cases, I think, because there are which connects to Gloria's point. There are cases, for instance, where the impassibility of the glorified bodies, for instance, which don't seem to have. So there is an agent which is acting on them in the same way as it would be acting on us, but somehow there is a mismatch between the active and passive powers in that case, for instance, because they just won't have the same kind of passive powers. That seems to be Aquinas's answer to that question. So I think, so the passive powers can sort of, you can wiggle with them a little bit. And then there are also cases of sort of virtual causation, which in which case, the active power sort of surpasses the passive power of the patient. So when, or vice versa. So you have, I don't know, when the heavenly bodies contain or the motion of the heavenly bodies contain virtually the generation of animals, and you can have different effects coming. So I think it's trickier, but yeah, I mean that's certainly I think that's a tool, and maybe there is not always a perfect fit. I think that's my concern.
So I think it's time to say with gratitude that no matter how moist any of our brains are, we cannot have failed to be acted upon by these very powerful agents. So let's thank our panel as we go into the break.